Hello. We'll take all of 2 minutes. And then we'll be like on schedule, right? Because at Temple Manual, I learned after 20 years, everything starts on schedule. Anyway, I'm Terry Swartz-Russell, in case you didn't know. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled that Steve, as he told you 3 years ago, brought this idea and said, you know, we got to do this, and it took us 3 years because there was something that happened in the middle of it. So, you know. Anyway, I love storytelling of all kinds, and here's my story, and then I'll let you hear from Rick. My dad died when I was 20 years old, and when I had children, I wanted them to know their grandfather. My father, their grandfather's 80 David. So what I did was I shared stories with my children with them as they grew up, so they would somehow know, quote unquote, their grandfather. And I knew I had succeeded when my children could finish my stories on their own, and that Zadie David truly had a place in their hearts and in their lives. So to me, I think that's the best way, and I think that that's what the Torah does for us, right? It's our story. It's not just my children's stories. So we're in for a treat, and today, or right now, we're going to hear about, here's the great title, if I can find it, what we can learn from Judaism's great tradition of storytelling and story making. If you want to read Rick's whole bio, I'm sure you've seen it, it's on the website, and I'm going to turn it over to him.
Good, and I have a mic already.
And you have a mic.
Good, thank you. Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. So once upon a time, there was a king. He had 2 children, and he had a daughter and a son. They were twins, and they lived in the lap of luxury. It was beyond anything you and I can hardly imagine. And everything they needed was provided for. The meals would go on for sometimes hours. Servants would bring platter after platter and course after course, and they thought everyone lived like this. One day, the king calls them into his study, and he says, I have a request of you both. You're now growing older, and someday you will be rulers of this kingdom when I'm gone. I want you to direct the servants to take all of the leftovers and put them in the basement. This was an absurd idea to them. Why would you even bother with used food when we have so much food? But they were respectful of their father, and so they directed the servants to do this, and they forgot about it. One day the king, he dies, and the 2 children rise up to take over the reins of the kingdom, and a nearby kingdom, seeing that perhaps this kingdom was weakened by the loss of a strong ruler, decides to attack. And pretty soon the whole palace is surrounded. Pretty soon they're cut off from any kinds of sources of food, and people are starving. Until someone who had almost forgotten about it says, what about all that food we've been putting away all these years in the basement, in the cool, dark basement? And went, oh. And they started bringing that food back up, and as you might imagine, they appreciated it a lot more the second time than they did the first time. So what do you think this story has to do with story and our stories?
This reminds me of Joseph, who saved so much, who saved the Egyptians.
Let me have the mic. Yeah. Yes. Okay.
This reminds me of Joseph, who put away food for, I guess,
For 7 years, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
So that when the famine came, he had provisions that he could to provide for his country people.
Okay, good. Yeah. So what's the metaphor, though, of this story about stories with regard to our life stories? Anybody have a sense of that? Yeah.
It's about repetition, that, the first time in good times you might write the story, but if you come back to it in troubling times, it can provide you advice and comfort through repetition.
Right. Yeah, I think that's pretty close to it. Anybody else have any other kind of insights from the story? So when we go through our life experiences, we don't think much of it, right? And it's only later when we're telling a story about something that occurred that we begin to appreciate it. So Steve's telling the story about statistics class this morning. I'd forgotten all about that's how we met. So here's something that seems so inconsequential, but gosh, if we hadn't been in statistics class, I wouldn't be here. And, so what are the odds of that, Steve? Yeah, there'll be a test. Yeah. That's why he needed my help in the help in the class. So stories are like that for us. They fill us in a way that are almost magical sometimes as we reminisce and we sit down and we talk. And as we get older, it becomes more important to look back than to look forward. And we kind of, something around age 50 or so, we kind of turn that corner. And next thing you know, what are we doing with our friends? Do you remember when? Right? We do that a lot. So there's this other side of story that comes from the word Shema Israel. So we repeat that watchword of our faith all the time. Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. And I'm going to suggest that the most important words in that phrase are not Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. It's Shema Israel. Listen up, people. Hear. Open up your ears and open up your hearts. I've got something to tell you right now. And it turns out in the Native American tradition of storytelling that listening is the first path to story. And they understood that without listening, there can be no story, there can be no transfer of culture, there can be no more sense of a people together. We have to be listening. So I'll tell you about another Moses, Johnny Moses, Native American storyteller that Elizabeth and I have gotten to know through the years. It's been many years now. And Johnny Moses, he is the keeper of the spirits for his people. He lives in the northwest part of the world and up near British Columbia. And when he's telling a story, he'll be right in the middle of the story, and then he'll pause and he'll look down. And he won't continue the story until the audience says, Hamakawich, we are listening. Shema Israel, we are listening. And every once in a while in the story, he'll just pause until he gets Hamakawich, we are listening. You should do that in Hebrew school, okay? Yeah, so, so we'll talk about that tomorrow in the education group. So story, I think, as I suggested in the Devar, is the most powerful force in the universe. I really think in our human universe, it's more powerful than the atom bomb. A story can have huge impact on the lives of people, and we can see the negative consequences of stories in our world today. They get spread so quickly through social media that aren't true, but people take them to be truth, and then they act on it in scary kind of ways. And stories begin to inhabit their consciousness. They actually inhabit their bodies in a way that take them over. And then stories can also be profoundly healing. So there's a wonderful anthropologist, Angelise Arian, and she studied indigenous people for many years. And when someone was not well in a community, they would go to the shaman, the Rebbe. And the shaman would ask them one of 4 questions. When did you stop singing? When did you stop dancing? When did you stop taking time to be quiet in nature, prayer, meditation? And when did you stop taking time to be enchanted by listening to and telling stories? So I think that story is the path, one of the core paths to the soul. And when we take time to listen to and be enchanted by stories and to tell stories, something happens that weaves us together and also connects us deeply to who we are. So one of the things in my work I've done is that I've been looking at this for some time, but if we look around at our lives, how many of you are spending time telling stories all the time to your friends? Some of you? A lot of you, okay. But if you look around the world, the places, I used to live in Orlando and did a lot of work with the Disney organization. And they built this little community called Celebration. And maybe you've been there. And it used to be all the front porches on houses. The porches were on the front of the house. And it was a place to welcome people to come and have a cup of tea and sit around and schmooze and tell stories. Most house construction now puts the porch on the back of the house. So we don't have public places, especially communal places, often to get together to share stories. And so in the architectural rules there, all the houses had to have front porches. They also put in video jacks because they knew that to get people out there, they wanted to be able to plug their TV in. So it was a compromise. But so there's been a process of what I call destorification, like deforestation. If you go and you cut all the trees down in a forest, and you plant a nice, neat rows of pine trees, the life of that forest doesn't come back, the rich life of that. The ecology, it doesn't have the richness of that. And so we have not been creating spaces for us to gather to tell stories. And it's had an impact, I think, on our society. So I think there's a kind of intelligence, I call it story intelligence. It's different from emotional intelligence or intellectual intelligence. And it's imbued in who we are as we are storytellers. And Descartes had it all wrong. When Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am," he had it all wrong. And not too long after he did that, someone came along. He named human beings Homo sapiens, wise humans. Okay, so I think he got that wrong too. I think actually story is really more defining of who we are. I story, therefore I am. And we are homo narrans, if you know Latin. We are storytelling humans. And that's what makes us unique as human beings. And I think there are 7 powers of story, and we don't have time to get deeply into them in an hour. It'd be an all-day kind of workshop. We're going to spend time with 5 of them. But let me tell you what the 7 powers are. The first is to transport, and I'll go into each of these a little more. Stories take us someplace else. Okay. The second is to communicate. And we all know people who are good teachers who use story, that somehow, for some reason, the kids kind of are engaged. I remember when I first started telling stories, and I went into some elementary schools, and I would get in there in the cafeteria, and you have 600 kids who were screaming, and I'd start telling a story, and the place would get quiet. And the teachers would go, "How did you do that?" It wasn't me, it was the story, right? Stories do something in a way in communication. We'll talk a little bit about the negative side of communication. We have a concept called Lashon Hara in our tradition. We'll talk a little bit. That's also communication, powerful. The third is to enable learning. And I did a lot of work through the years with a woman named Paula Underwood who came out of the Native American tradition, the Oneida tradition. They did not have a word for teach. The closest translation was enabler of learning, because they understood that you couldn't teach anybody anything. All you could do is provide the conditions in which they might learn. Okay, and so we spent a lot of time teaching and trying to shove stuff down kids' throats, and yet what they would do is they would tell stories. And they would ask a simple question. It was the question I asked last night, those of you who were here last night, after telling a short story about Elijah the prophet. What might we learn from this story? And that's the question they would ask. And they would start with children very young, and they'd tell the same story over and over again as the child grew older and older and older. They would tell that. They would ask, what might you learn from this? And they understood that a 5-year-old's mind is going to access the story through the lens of a 5-year-old. And a 10-year-old will see it differently and maybe have other insights. And they would acknowledge each of those insights. And they acknowledged the wisdom of young children. They understood that they had a way of seeing that we adults have sort of gotten reified, and we don't see the world because we've been so accustomed to seeing it the same way, we can't see things freshly. And that's our blind spot. The fourth is to create meaning. We use stories to create meaning, and there's a lot to talk about there, and that's where I spent a lot of time talking about reminiscence and the sharing of stories in that way. We'll spend more time with that actually tomorrow, so that's the tickler for tomorrow's workshop in the morning. We'll spend a lot of time with that. The cousin of that is transformation. Stories can transform our life experiences powerfully. And you can take something, and this is what we were talking about this morning in the Talmud class. How do you take a painful, difficult experience and work with it in a way that it can become actually something sweet and wonderful? Doesn't feel that way when you're in the middle of the pain. But somehow a story can take us to a new place. The sixth power of story is to unite. And we've seen a lot in our world today how stories powerfully disconnect us. Look at all the polarization we talk about in our political scene today. And you can just look at the landscape of everything that's happening in countries all over the world. There's a lot that disunites us. And you can see how stories powerfully inform the disunity. You can look at every genocide that has happened in the world, and what you will find inside of that genocide is a story being told by others that dehumanize them. We experienced it in the Holocaust in Germany. You can look at what happened in Rwanda. Just look around the world, and every place you go, you will find a story being told that minimizes the humanity of the other person, makes them less than human. Yet stories can also powerfully bring us together, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And finally, we'll talk about the power of story to envision new possibilities. It turns out that the part of our brains that we use for recollection and memory are also the same places in the brain that we use for prospection and thinking about the future. So those are the powers. So let's jump into each one of them, and we'll kind of do some things with it and have some fun. So if I said to you, once upon a time, the cow jumped over the moon. Anybody object to that? Yeah. And I said, and then the cow went all the way to Mars and jumped over Mars as well. None of you would say, wait a second. I've never seen a cow jump over a fence. How's he going to jump over the moon? How's the cow going to do? And what are they going to breathe up there? Unless some of you are scientists, you might have been starting to think that way. I don't know. You might have been thinking that way. I don't know, possibly. We better study this cow. Yeah, this is an unusual cow, right? Right. We willingly suspend our disbelief. What we do is that when we're listening to a story, we willingly suspend our disbelief, and we go with the storyteller, and now we're with the cow jumping over the moon. And your initial response would be, well, what happened next? Okay? We don't say, that's not real, that's not possible. We let go of that realm and we enter into story reality. When we go into a Torah story, like today, we're listening to the story of Rebecca and Isaac, or listening to the story of Abraham negotiating for a cave for his wife. We willingly suspend disbelief and we get transported back in time, thousands of years back in time. And it's as though we're standing right there while the negotiation is going on for the cave. And we're going back and forth and back. We're there. We're there. So stories in the Torah, I think, are a form of time travel. They're a technology for time travel. That's basically what the Torah is. It's a technological machine. It's like H.G. Wells. It's a machine for time travel that allows us to go back and re-experience what all these characters were experiencing in their own lives in real time. And, even though we have all these other rituals and things that kind of bind us, it's the stories that do it for us. Can you imagine taking storytelling out of Judaism? What would be left? A bunch of rules and regulations, and it wouldn't last. It's the stories that sustain it. So transportation becomes crucial to everything that happens with story. And if we want to understand the world of another person, we sit down and say, tell me your story. And you start telling me your story, and suddenly you may have been somebody that I didn't think I could even like. And the next thing I know, you're kind of like me. And suddenly we find that we have commonality. We'll do an experience tomorrow morning where I ask people, tell me about your people and what did you learn from them? And I've done this with diverse groups of people. And I mean, really diverse from different parts of the world, different cultures. And the next thing usually what I'm hearing is that even though we came from different worlds, we had this common experience growing up. So stories allow us to go into another's world and really deeply understand what their experience has been like and have empathy for them. I think that's really the source of empathy. And we know now from research is that reading stories about people who are different from us allows us to empathize with them and appreciate them more. Adults who read stories, who may have prejudice about certain groups, and they read a story about someone, their prejudice levels go down. Just fiction can do that. The act of just reading a fictional story. So that's the first one. Let me stop here. If you have a question, I'll stop. This doesn't have to be a one-way conversation. So raise your hand, and if something comes up, let's have a conversation, okay? The second power of story is to communicate, and you could say, devarim is words, right? And was that a question? No, that was a yawn. Okay, I thought I saw you. So listen to this little piece from chapter 4. Be careful and guard well your life, that you never forget the happenings which your eyes have seen, and let them not depart from your memory throughout your life. Transmit to your children and their descendants the reverential event of that day when you stood before the Eternal, your Almighty, in Oreb Sinai. And I would say, tell them the story. When the Eternal said to me, assemble the people to me, and I will communicate my words, my stories, to them, so that they learn how to revere me as long as they live upon the earth, and they in turn shall transmit them to their children. So, Torah is commanding us to tell the stories over and over again. And how do we bring children into the tribe? It's through the stories. And I think it's also through the music. If you listen to children singing the songs, and often the lyrics are stories, right? So it turns out when they've taken people and put them in MRI machines, and you could have 2 or 3 people in an MRI machine and another person in an MRI machine, and they're looking at what's going on with their brain waves. And what you see is very distinctive signatures with each person. There's all kinds of things going on. But as soon as the person in the MRI machine starts to tell a story that the others can hear it, all their brains entrain. They all start to look the same. The teller and the listeners. Powerful stuff. A story could actually take a whole group of people who are in very different places, and suddenly they're on the same page in a sense, and they're totally synced in. That's why a powerful speaker can suddenly rouse a whole group of people to action, because now they've been infected with this story, right? So the other side of that is Lashon Hara. Is anyone not familiar with the concept of Lashon Hara? So I became very, very, very aware of this concept many years ago. Elizabeth and I, we had just moved into a house. We were doing a renovation, and we had a young guy who was referred to us by a friend of ours whose his wife was his secretary. He worked at Disney, and he was doing all kinds of projects, and I had an office in the house, so I got to know him pretty well. And one day he said, I'm going to be not here Thursday and Friday. I've got some business to do down at the courthouse. And I kiddingly said, you're not going to jail, are you, John? And there's a long pause, and he said, oh, no. See you Monday. He came back Monday, and he told me his story. Years ago, his best friend's wife had been murdered. Terrible event. Pretty soon the police moved in and figured out it was the best friend who did it, the husband. He had taken out an insurance policy 2 weeks before. Smart guy. And it was not looking good for him. Probably like the death sentence. They said he probably would just get life if he could finger the person who did the shooting. So in an act of desperation, he made up a story. He said his best friend had done the shooting. One day there's a knock on the door. The police come in and they say, "Can we talk with you a minute?" And the next thing you know, he's up against the wall. He's being handcuffed. They're ripping the house apart looking for the gun. He's put in jail. His wife decides to divorce him. He's in jail without bail for 6 months until his friend recants. He says, "I made it up." So when it happened, it was front page news on the paper. Where do you think the news of his release was? It wasn't on the front page. It was on page 16, and it was probably maybe an inch or two of space. Everywhere he went, everywhere he walked, people would cross to the other side of the road. And at some point, he said, "I had to leave town." He left town, moved to Colorado, met his current wife, and at some point they decided to move back to Orlando. So we know that words are powerful, and it destroyed his life. It's an extreme example. But words can do that. They're that powerful. And if we look at the tenor of what goes on in the media today, what do you have? It's a machine for Lashon Hara. And we can look, and it's the trade. If you're not doing it, you're not getting attention. And if you're not getting attention, you're not getting ratings. And it has to be a bigger story every time. And it destroys lives. So we can see how that works powerfully in our lives. So there's a wonderful quote from Psalms, says, "Which man desires life who loves days of seeing good?" He says, "Guard your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking deceit." And we repeat those words every day in our liturgy. Every day we repeat them, and I'm not sure we're hearing them. Shema Israel, are we really hearing them and watching what we say about our neighbors and our friends and people who are close to us? So there's a wonderful story that I think powerfully illustrates that. There's a woman in a community who has been spreading all kinds of rumors about other people, and they're destructive, and it's getting out of hand. And finally the Rebbe calls her in and says, "You've got to stop this immediately. Stop it." And she's chastened by his words. And she said, "Okay, Rabbi, I'll do my best to stop it." He says, No, I have a task for you. So I want you to go tomorrow to the town square and take a feather pillow, and I want you to split it open and let the feathers out, and then I want you to collect all the feathers and bring them back to me. And you all probably heard this story, right? And the feathers fly everywhere, and there's no way to ever get all those feathers back. And so it is with our words. Our words, once they leave our lips and they start to travel out, we can't control them. And they have a great power, and they can literally destroy a life. The third power story is to enable learning. And if I would say that Torah as a vehicle, it's all set up for us to learn. It's constantly an opportunity for us to learn, and all the stories give us an opportunity. And we saw with the rabbi today as he was beginning to weave together this concept of wounds from past lives, and then how can we learn from that and begin to look at the life of Isaiah through a different lens. And so there's a story called "Who Speaks for Wolf?" And I think I'll tell you the story. I think we've got enough time to tell the story. And it comes from the Native American tradition, but it gives you a kind of a feeling for what's possible with story from a learning perspective. So a long time ago, their people had outgrown where they were living. And they didn't have enough room in the land, they didn't have enough resources, and they realized they needed to find a new place to live. And so they sent scouts out in every direction to find a new place. Maybe it was the land of milk and honey, What was Moses doing? Looking for this new place to live where people could feel nourished and thrive. And one of the scouts they sent out, his name was Wolf's brother. And he got this name because he had such an intimate knowledge of the wolf people. He followed them. He saw everything that they did, and he could tell you, if you sat down with him by the fire, why wolves played together as pups, like our children do, and why wolves would mate for life, and why even wolf was curious about us human beings, because wolf would often come to the edge of the light of the fire and watch humans at night. So he was one of the scouts that went out, and when the scouts came back, they each had a story. And they were each certain that the place they had found was the place that was perfect for the tribe. One talked about clear running waters. Another talked about high, dry places where they could build their long houses. Another talked about open fields where they could plant their three sisters, beans, corn, and squash. And so it went. Now, those who were experts in each of these things listened. She who had knowledge of their three sisters, beans, corn, and squash, and he who understood the running waters, and she who understood how to do longhouse construction. And they listened to all the experts weigh in and give their opinion. And finally, a consensus was emerging. And in those days, the chief was not somebody who imposed his ideas upon the tribe. He was there as a consensus builder. And he saw that a consensus was emerging for a particular place. And he spoke it, and the people nodded. But someone raised their hand and said, "What about Wolf's brother? He hasn't returned yet. We haven't heard from him." And the chief said, "Well, who knows what's happened to Wolf's brother? Maybe there was a late winter storm, and he could be weeks away from coming back, and we have to send an advance party to prepare the land now. And maybe he was killed by a bear. Who knows? We have to act now and move forward." And so they sent an advance party. The people were packing and preparing to make this move when Wolf's brother does return. And when he hears where they've decided to move, he counsels against it. He says, "You've chosen a place where a great community of wolves lives. And I fear there won't be enough room for them and for us." The chief says, "Well, we've always accommodated wolves. Certainly wolf can accommodate us this one time." And Wolf's brother just shook his head and said, "No, I don't think so." But they did not listen, and so they moved. And it was like Shangri-La. It was everything they wanted. There was plenty of places for their long houses. The game was so plentiful they could almost reach out and grab a deer by its horns. They didn't even have to shoot it. Fish in the waters, open fields for their crops. No one saw wolf in the shadows watching. One day, a hunter came and he leaned his catch up against the longhouse. And he went in to fetch a container. And when he came back, he saw a wolf dragging it away. So the people gathered to discuss this, and they decided that a little food for rent was not a bad trade. So they began leaving food at the edge of the village. And pretty soon wolves were coming more aggressive, and they were wandering among the longhouses. And the women, they said, "We can't have wild wolves wandering around with our children." And the elders agreed with that. So they put men all around the village, and they drove Wolf off, and pretty soon he was his old, untamed self. One day, she who's in charge of winter stores comes to the elders and says, "I fear if we have a long, difficult winter, we won't have enough food." So they gathered to discuss this, and they saw that feeding Wolf was part of the problem because they were giving their food away to Wolf. They saw that having men gathered around the village edge was part of the problem as well, because they could have been out hunting. Someone said, "We could kill off this wolf people." And someone said, "Would we rather kill than move a little?" So this could be just a story about a people who went through a very difficult winter, and at the end of the winter moved. And it could even be a story about a people who from then on took wolf into consideration in every decision. But they saw that there was something deeply flawed in the way they made their decision. And so they saw that there were things that they did not know that they did not know, and that they had not explored the flow of energy and possibilities, the future stories, to their end conclusion. And finally, after discussing things from then on, someone would stand and speak for the things that they did not know, and say, "Tell me now, my brothers, tell me now, my sisters, who speaks for Wolf?" So I'm going to ask you the age-old question that's been asked for thousands of years. What might you learn from this story? or no right. I tell you, let's do this. Turn to a neighbor and discuss it for 3 minutes. Find a neighbor. What might you learn from this story? And then we'll come back. About 30 more seconds, then we get you back. So let me get you back if I could. Anybody willing to share an insight that they might have garnered from this story? You can just raise his hand. Thanks for volunteering.
You needed a volunteer.
I needed
right?
a volunteer, right?
Volunteer,
Yeah,
right.
I needed a shill in the audience.
Volunteer. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Okay, does. I'll be
I don't know if that's on. Is that on? Can we get?
Wait, is this on?
Now it's on.
It's on.
Now it's
Okay.
on.
So our conclusion was, in brief, just get all the facts together before you make a decision.
Get all the facts together before you make a decision. Right behind you here. Yeah. Okay.
I shared that when the men were all in a defensive mode, they weren't going out and hunting. They weren't taking care of the rest of the family. And I think that's very important. Is you can't be always in defensive mode. You need to be on the maybe not offensive, but at least be on a productive mode, maybe a better word, and go live your life and not live defensively.
Yeah. So you could personalize that and see. Let's back over here. This is a very productive row right here.
So the other thing that I heard in that story was that the wolf man was someone who has been telling stories for a long time. He has a sense of tradition and of past of the wolf people, whereas the other spies just had a very short-term experience seeing the land, and yet the tribe relied on this short-term observation instead of on the long-term observation of the person who had a sense of the wolf's story, perhaps.
Yeah. What happened when we sent spies into the land of milk and honey? And what did they came back with stories, right? Yeah. And they're giants. They're it's a dangerous place. How are we going to survive all that? Yeah. And those stories were powerfully destructive in a way. Yeah. Any others? Yeah, right over here. Yeah.
I'm not sure I heard the story accurately, but it sounds like beware of the tyranny of the majority.
Beware of the yeah, and that's true. In this story, the majority, they didn't have the wisdom. We had someone right here. How about one more, and then we'll move on.
This reminds me of an interview I saw recently with George Saunders. Some of you may know he's a wonderful story writer, a professor at Syracuse University. And he was being interviewed at the New York Public Library, and he was talking about the root of all conflict, human conflicts, is a failure to see the other, in this case the wolf, as having part of this. He's a Buddhist, so he says the spark of the Buddha in him, but we would say the spark of God in the other individual, including the wolf. And the resolution, he says, to all conflict is, there's no choice, he says. It has to be human kindness. We can't survive if we don't treat each other with kindness. We can't survive if we don't recognize that the wolf is is a being, one of God's being, and treat the wolf with some kindness as well.
Yeah, beautiful. Lovely. Thank you. Anyone sitting on something really they just have to say? Okay. Right here.
That we rush to decisions sometimes. We've got to go, we've got to decide, we've got to do something, and not all the evidence is in yet.
Right.
And also the lack of inclusivity, that is important to be inclusive, to bring all the stakeholders in.
I've never rushed to decisions, have I? So, in our tradition, in the Jewish tradition, we have a body of learning stories. So last night I told this Elijah the prophet story. And Elijah the prophet is really an interesting character in the pantheon of stories that we have, Jewish stories. He shows up in Kings. I guess I wouldn't say he's a minor prophet, he's an important prophet, but, it's a very short little piece with him, And some books are, devoted to some characters at great length. We don't have a whole body of folk stories about David or Moses or, Aaron or any of Solomon, and a few stories about Solomon, but there are over 600 kind of catalog stories in the folklore about Elijah the prophet. So it's interesting. Elijah, who's the other character in biblical history who did not die and went straight to heaven? Enoch, yeah. Enoch. He's the seventh generation. Early in Genesis, there's so-and-so lived, they lived so many years. Enoch lived 365 years. 365 days in the year. He's seventh generation. Seven's an important number for us, and he walked with God. I don't remember exactly what it says, but he didn't die. And he supposedly went on and became an angel. So it turns out that in early Jewish folk literature, Enoch was a very important character. When the Christians came along, they saw in Enoch a model for Jesus, who rose up to heaven. And they adopted Enoch as a model, and this was troubling to the rabbis at that time. And so what were they going to do? Get rid of all these old stories? They substituted Elijah the prophet. Elijah became the chief heroic figure. And Elijah shows up in all kinds of ways. He shows up at brisses, shows up at our Passover Seders. Talmudic scholars will pray that Elijah the prophet will show up in a dream and answer a question for them. That is a perplexing question, and maybe that Elijah will have the answer for it. Supposedly, the Kabbalah was dictated by Elijah to a couple of rabbis. He brought it down. He shows up in a lot of places, and he often shows up as a beggar, as someone who is very unassuming. So Reb Shmuel ben Yosef one day, he's been very perturbed by everything he sees in the world. There's a great deal of distressing things in his world, and the more he looks around, the more depressed he becomes. And he sees good people having bad things happen to them, and people who are not such nice people having good things happen to them. And the more he looks, the more perplexed he becomes, and the more depressed he becomes. And he prays that if he could just spend a day with Elijah the prophet, watching Elijah perform all of his many miracles, that he would be satisfied. It would bring him solace to do that. And of course, one day he's walking along, and who greets him along the road it's Elijah the prophet. He says, "I hear you called." And he says, "Yes." He said, "I'd like to follow you for a day." And Elijah says, No. You're going to slow me down. You're going to start asking questions, and I don't have time. I got too much to do. And he says, "I promise you I won't ask any questions. I just want to observe." And Elijah finally agrees. And so they're walking along, and they come to a farmhouse. A lovely old couple lives there, and they welcome them very warmly, and they don't have much, but they share the food they have with them, and they talk Torah, and they have a wonderful evening, and they give them their bedroom to sleep in. These people are very gracious. And as they're leaving the next morning, Elijah the prophet, as he's walking by their barn with their one possession, a cow, he nods like this, and the cow drops dead. And Reb Shmuel ben Yosef, he sees this, and he's like, how could he do that after all these people have done for us? And he kills their cow? And he is really upset. He can't hold it in. He says, "Why did you do that? After all they've done for us?" And Elijah the prophet says, "I told you. If you're going to ask questions, you're going to have to leave immediately. You're going to have to decide. Are you going to not ask questions, or are you going to just go on?" And he commits not to ask any more questions. They come walking along. They get to a house of a very, very wealthy man. There's a wall there. It's got glass shards on the top of the wall, and there's a gate. And they ring the bell, and a servant comes and says, "What do you want?" He says, "We're travelers, and we just would like a place to rest and some food." And the owner yells out, "Who is it?" "A couple of beggars. Stick them in the barn." And he points to the barn. They don't get any food, and they have to sleep with the animals in the hay. That night, there's a terrible storm. And a gigantic tree that's in the middle of the yard of this man's house gets toppled over, just uprooted. And as they're leaving that morning, Elijah the prophet nods, and the tree just immediately rights itself, and the roots go deeply into the ground. This is troubling, Reb Shmuel, after what this guy did to us. And he made the tree go back. I don't understand. They travel on. They get to a synagogue in a town, and they go in and they pray. And they're expecting, it's a very wealthy synagogue, a lot of wealth in the synagogue. They're expecting that someone is going to take them home for a meal and put them up. And every person, as they walk by them, they look at these people, and they're dressed as beggars. No one offers them a place. No one offers them a meal, and so they go hungry, and they sleep on the back pews of the shul. And the next morning, there's prayers. And as they're leaving, Elijah the prophet, he blesses them. He said, "May all of you become great leaders." This is even more perplexing to Shmuel. Why would he give it such a blessing? And they travel to another town, and it's a very poor town, but the people in the shul, they warmly greet them. They feed. They say, "We have guests from out of town. People come bring food to the shul." They have a festivities, and they're put up for the night and treated like royalty. And as they're departing the next morning, Elijah the prophet blesses them and says, "May one of you be a great leader. May one of you be a great leader." At this, Reb Shmuel can't take it anymore. Why would you just bless one of them? And finally he says, "I don't understand. I'll leave immediately, but you've got to explain to me what you've been doing." And Elijah the prophet says, "Listen, that couple who had the cow, I saw that it was ordained in heaven that she was to die that night. And I bargained with God to take the cow in her stead. You know that man where the tree had been uprooted? There was a large chest of gold under the roots of that tree. I did not want him to have it. In the synagogue where I blessed everyone that they should be great leaders, can you imagine if everyone in this synagogue was a leader and there were no followers? What kind of havoc that would play in the place? And how blessed we would be if we had a leader who was as wise as King Solomon among us. So sometimes when we look out and we see bad things happening to good people, maybe they're being saved from something much worse. And when we see good things happening to bad people, in the end, they get their just deserts. And that's the story. Any reflections on that story? We have a question over here. Yes.
The problem with this story, and also with the story that we discussed this morning about the horses and about the carriage stuck behind the official, is that they all have these contrived happy endings. These stories don't convince me unless they can convince me with sad endings. Otherwise, they're just fairy tales. They don't reflect the complexity of the real world. That's where they lose me.
Got it. I hear you. I hear you. How's that? Is that true for other people? Anybody else have that same experience? Well, we don't have time to, yeah.
Well, I was just going to say that, but these stories open up the possibility that there are things you don't know and that you might not see the good results and you'd like to see it right away, but it might be down the line and at least we could consider the possibility that there's more that we don't know.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, though. Yes, one more.
The core message of that story is that we are not all-knowing, and sometimes suspending judgment is the most important thing. To have the humility to accept what we don't know, which I think ties between your last two stories, and and the humility and acceptance of that.
Yeah, and if you look at events in the world today, and we were talking about Ukraine this morning came up, and is this a good thing or a bad thing? It's certainly a bad thing for people who have died. It's not been a good thing for the family losses, but we don't have the perspective of history, do we? Maybe in 15 years we could tell a different story in looking back at this time, but we can't. It's very hard for us to think that far ahead. So we have time for two more powers. And the sixth power is to unite. And as I said, we have lots in our world that disconnects us powerfully. And in the Jewish tradition, we have an interesting history. There were two houses, Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. And as you know, there were always debates about very key issues, and it seems like the house of Hillel seemed to win out most of the time. And the scholars are divided about this, but apparently at some point there was a debate about some key things, and 3,000 students of Beit Hillel were murdered by the students of Beit Shammai over Torah. Okay? But we see stuff like this happening in our world all the time, where people, for holy reasons, are murdered. So we have that. And also in our Jewish history, we have an interesting tradition which has sort of gone dormant. There were Rodfei Shaloms and Mitchavei Shaloms, peace mediators or pursuers of peace, who were in communities. They weren't rabbis. They were often lay people. And they were responsible for reconciling people in conflict. We have professionals now who do that, But, so we have a history, and it's a long history of doing that. And so, there's a wonderful little story, I'll just read it to you. It's Rabbi Baroka was in the market one day, and Elijah the prophet comes to him and says, "Who in this market has a share in the world to come?" He says, Elijah responds, "No one." And then these two gentlemen come walking along. He says, "But those two, those two have a share in the world." So Rabbi Baroka is really interested in who these two people are, and he goes and says, "What do you do?" He said, "Oh, we're jesters." Jesters. So when we see people who are sad and unhappy, we do everything we can to bring happiness into their life. And if two people are fighting, we playfully help them reconcile their differences. Interesting, huh? So there's a story in a wonderful book called Civility by Stephen Carter, who's African American. And when he was very young, probably 7 or 8 years old, his parents were professionals, and they moved into Washington, D.C., into an all-white community. And he's sitting on the porch one day, and he's watching people walk by, and no one is saying hello. No one is even acknowledging their presence. And he's thinking to himself, this is going to be a place where I will have no friends. There will be no one here that I can have as an ally. I will be an unhappy person. And a few minutes later, there's this woman comes walking down the street, and she waves, hello, welcome to the neighborhood. I live across the street. I'll be right back. And she runs into her house. She makes cream cheese sandwiches and brings them back and brings them to them. And they become fast friends. Her name was Sarah Kestenbaum. She was Jewish, right? And in that one moment, everything shifted for him. Everything shifted for him. And what was Sarah Kestenbaum pickled in? She was pickled in our stories about Hesed, about welcoming the stranger, loving the stranger. And she lived it every day. Lived it every day. And that changed the whole course of Stephen Carter's life in that one moment when she showed him an act of kindness. So there's one last power of story, which is to envision possibilities. And I thought I would just close with this story. So in the Holocaust, time of World War II, there was a French poet, not Jewish, named Robert Desnos. And he was outspoken against the Nazis. He was arrested. And like so many other intellectuals, he ended up in Buchenwald. And one day, he, along with a lot of other people, were put into a lorry and driven out to the countryside, told to get out, and they all knew what was coming. And as they're standing in line, Robert Desnos did something that was remarkable. He stepped out of the line and he took the hand of a woman standing next to him. He said, "Can I tell your fortune?" And she sort of woke up out of a daze. She said, "Tell my fortune?" He said, "Yes, can I tell your fortune?" And she said, "Okay." And he said, "Oh, I can see that you're going to have 2 children. A beautiful husband and a home and a life of richness, and you're going to live to an old age." Someone next to her said, "Tell my fortune," and reached out his hand. And then another person, and he started making up stories about their lives and the lives they were going to live. And something got transformed in that moment in the line. People suddenly, they came alive. And the guards were watching this. They had shot many people before who were almost near death already. They didn't have the heart to shoot people who had a future. They put them back in the lorry and drove them back to camp. Not all of them survived Buchenwald, but some did, to tell the story of what happened that day. We need the future. And we need people who are good storytellers, who can paint stories about the future. And I tell you, we Jews, we're probably as well equipped as anyone, because we're the people of the story, right? We know about story. It's in our bones. And we, I think, have to take responsibility for healing the world, Tikkun Olam. And we have to do that by envisioning a better world and a better story. So thank you a lot for having me. We'll see you hopefully tonight, if you can join us, for a wonderful story that comes from an ancient time in the 1600s. Thanks so much. I'll stick around if we got 5 minutes. If there's
I just
more
wanted to
questions.
say thank you, Rick. I want to tell everybody that Rick's book, Story Intelligence, will be sold after tonight's program and tomorrow morning's program. And so you should all stay tuned. We hope we've whet your appetite for more. So when I was little and I watched television with my parents, we used to watch Peyton Place, right? And you'd get to the end of the session, and it would always say, "Stay tuned for more."
To be continued.
To be continued, right? Do you know how to say it in Yiddish? I love this. Weiters morgen. So it means something tomorrow, right? So there's more tomorrow. So come back, because weiters morgen. My kids know that word. Anyway, thank you again.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you. Thank you all.